Yeah, so I'll kick off a little bit. I'll introduce myself, what's been happening in the space, and then I'll invite Joel to join me in the conversation, and we'll have a bit of a question and answer session. So appropriately, I didn't get a chance to introduce myself in the whip around, and I think that's worked out well because I can do so now. So I'm a web developer. I've been developing for almost 12 years or so, and have done some work in not-for-profit spaces like the Australian College of Rural and Remote Medicine, working with the eHealth team there, and National Gallery of Victoria as well. And right now I've got a website that I do during the day, and I'm helping get things going with the Humane Technology Australia. And we're looking to be a satellite group that supports the work that the Centre for Humane Technology does over in the US. So I'll briefly talk about what humane technology is and what our goals are in Australia. And hopefully we'll have some time for audience questions. We'll see how we go, I suppose. So given the audience of the meetup, there's probably some level of familiarity of the topic, but I'll do a bit of a speed summary, and then we can have a common foundation for discussion, which I think is something that's lacking generally these days. So I think that's pretty important. The attention economy and the impacts of social media are a pretty hot topic at the moment since the release of the popular Netflix documentary, The Social Dilemma. I'll just switch to gallery view. How many people have seen The Social Dilemma so far? We've got got a few shakes and a few nods. Okay, so the Social Dilemma features the co-founders of the Centre for Humane Technology from the US, one of which, Tristan Harris, has also appeared on this week's Q&A on ABC, and has been on Sam Harris's podcast and on Ellen's show as well. The two co-founders are Silicon Valley techies who were growing concerned about the effects that technology is having on us at an individual level, such as increased rates of mental health issues, especially in younger teenagers, and also on how it's polarizing us and fracturing our shared understanding of what's going on in the world. And it sort of threatens the very idea of being able to talk with someone about the same reality these days. It's making it more difficult to have healthy public discourse about issues like COVID's source, for example, and the government responses to it, or the Black Lives Matter movement. And I think we can all relate to things that have popped up in the media and public stunts that relate around those things and the differences in opinion there. And just today it came out that Magda Szubanski and Nigel Yuan were the subject of coordinated attacks of hate on Twitter by right-wing extremist groups as a response to government ads on wearing masks that recently screened in Victoria. The message of humane technology isn't anti-technology. It's not just a suggestion to take a digital detox. We're about looking at tangible, quantifiable impacts and tracing these problems back to design mechanisms and engagement strategies that are at the core of business models in the technology products that we use every day. Our goals are to raise awareness around the seriousness of these issues, link our social fragmentation back to its sources where it's clear there is a link, and advocate for solutions and interventions, working with both the technology industry as well as government. Tristan Harris, one of the co-founders, has spoken at multiple US Senate hearings, for example, to give his insights into the harms that tend to be downplayed when you ask the big tech companies what's going on. So James and myself and a few others that we've got to officiate are looking to do similar work here in Australia, and especially understanding what's different about Australian society and our technology and communications ecosystems, which might require a different approach to the US, as well as understand the implications of the fact that none of the tech giants are headquartered in Australian soil, yet they're still changing the ways that we're communicating and spending our time in all of the same ways. We're looking to be a point of reference for the public generally, as well as having a close relationship with technologists specifically to educate and have two-way conversations to understand the issues as they see them. we're hoping to soon organise some roundtable think tanks with experts across technology, government, sociology, psychology, various fields that would have perspectives on this situation, so that we can explore solutions and put together position statements and recommendations to legislators. I'll bring Joël into the conversation now. Joël Kalmanowicz is a principal product manager at Atlassian and has been a product manager on Google Glass, Plus, Maps, and Assistant. And he was at Google in Silicon Valley when Tristan Harris was there and had sent his original internal slide deck raising concerns about ethical practices in the tech space. So yeah, thanks for taking some time, Joël. What was your reaction when you opened Tristan's slide deck?
I think more than anything else, it was excitement, because there was this sort of latent feeling of, it was still early on. I had joined Google, I think, don't remember exactly how many months it had been. It's 8 years ago now, but I had recently come over. I finished uni in Australia. I went over to Silicon Valley to join in and go to the Googleplex and everything. And there was this latent feeling of like, oh, this is all really cool. Like, surely there's got to be some catch, like that this is. And as I learned and was trained by Google, and it's interesting how that happens. I would do things like we would have book clubs, and we would have books like Nir Eyal's Hooked, How to Create Habit-Forming Products, on our book list. And it was essentially like, sure, you didn't have to read the book, but we would all talk about it. There's product managers and this new wave of PMs joining the company, and we'd read through that, and I'd go, this sounds a lot like some stuff that I had learned from some psychology electives I took at uni. Really interesting to see it directly applied towards like making people do things in tech, towards like literally calling it habit forming, not just like engagement. Like that there was not even a veneer of trying to make it seem acceptable. It was just like, oh, prima facie, this is fine. We are making people form habits to use our products. And that was weird. So when I read Tristan's slide deck, I was like, this is great. Someone's actually like really thinking about it. See, I knew it wasn't just going to be a matter of that we're all just kind of going in face first to do all this stuff without really thinking about it. I knew people were thinking about it. This is great. I was really excited. And as he calls out in the social dilemma, that lasted for a brief moment of time, and then nothing happened.
It's easy to get swept up in the culture of something, and when everyone's swimming the same way downstream, it makes its own current, I think. And to break away from that pack is something that's hard to do, and there's definitely been a few people who've been brave enough to do that. I made the bold claim earlier that technology companies are threatening the possibility that we can have a shared understanding of reality and objective truth. Do you agree with that claim? And if so, what is it in particular that's causing the threat, perhaps for people who haven't seen Social Dilemma or are familiar with the topic?
I would definitely agree. I mean, you've hedged it, right? You've said they can be a threat. But I agree that it does happen. And it's not just that this is a social media thing. If we get into it, there are some interesting examples of mainstream media causing the same rifts. But I don't know about the rest of you. I'd actually be quite interested to see. So I'll tell you a very quick story, and then I'd love to know, how many of you have experienced something like this. I have a family member I used to be really close to, and we hung out a lot. It was an in-law. He's in Canada, and hung out as much as we could when I visited. Friendly guy, also a bit of a techie, works in IT as he calls it. And earlier this year, he just started sharing some moderately weird content into our family group chat. Stuff with like, he started talking about this like, oh, the globalist agenda, and I was like, I wonder what he means by that. Oh well. Within a few weeks, he moved from the globalist agenda to just outright conspiracy theories. COVID-19 was created by Bill Gates. It was also created by the Chinese Communist Party, and it's also harmless. All of the above at the same time. So it started getting messy. And even as he pushed these into the family group chat, what I found interesting was it just kind of immediately semantically linked like, oh, other conspiracies or misinformation of the past. And for me, he kind of went across the line more than anything else when he started talking about Planned Parenthood in the States, like selling baby parts, which is like a thoroughly debunked thing that also is really unpleasant to have in your family group chat. Just be confronted with that. I'm one of quite a large number of parents in that group chat. I confronted him about it, and it was amazing. It always ended with him just doing outright character assassination. Like anything I said or anyone else said or any other claim or any other source who disagreed with him was basically terrible. Oh, the Washington Post, it's the Washington Compost. Oh, Joel, you think something else? Clearly, you're having some cognitive dissonance. That's a serious mental illness. I hope you get better soon. That sort of thing. And it's gotten to the point that like I can't talk to him anymore. So I'd love to see, like, for the rest of you, in any form, like, have you had those sorts of interactions where, like, wow, I thought I knew this person, but they seem to believe all these things that I just don't understand how they believe these things. I'm gonna do something visual I can see a bit better than a tiny nod. Yeah, a couple of here and there. For those of you who haven't, I'm glad. I hope that is more a reflection of the company you keep and their ability to be resilient to this than the fact that you just don't know, because it's pretty likely.
And it's not always easy to know other people's thoughts, and they can keep them to themselves.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think that one of the differences between how things used to be pre kind of social media, and even though we had different sources of information that may be in different wings of the political bias, is that at least you knew you were watching or say reading the Murdoch Press, or reading the Weekly or something like that, and you knew what stream you were consuming. Whereas I'm on Facebook, you're on Facebook, we, without thinking about it, we kind of just assume we're looking at the same Facebook. Or it's easy to unconsciously forget that everyone's got this, or the however many billion users all have their own different reality being presented to them. So I was thinking I could get you to talk about cognitive biases and how technology came to be so good at targeting them, because sometimes we think it might be an evil plotting room at Facebook, and it's not just about Facebook, but we seem to use it as a bit of an example. Like, are they strategizing how to make us outraged and addicted there, or is there something else that's going on?
It's it's funny. It's such a difficult problem. They are actively strategizing how not to do that, right? They have quite a substantial team that's been working on this for quite a while. And I know from the outside, I'm among the number of people outside of Facebook, but I still have plenty of friends who like work there. I'm still in contact with my friends in the Bay Area whose COVID haircuts go down to here, right? Because they literally can't leave their homes. And yeah, they're really strongly trying to prevent these things, but it is a big uphill battle against a lot of human nature. There's a really detailed series for those of you who would like to dig into the great depth. Wait, but why? Has done a great series called The Story of Us. It's still in progress, but there's many episodes. Yeah, I highly recommend it. But in summary, some of the most notable biases at play. So there are a couple of things. The series goes into more detail about studies and everything. So check citations there. But essentially, there are a few things. One of the most notable ones is that among human beings, as we discuss things, we tend to have two primary emotions that cause us to be most likely to share content. Does anyone, if you actually already know, don't say it, but does anyone have any guesses what those two emotions are?
Is it rage, frustration?
Yep, anger is one of them. That's right. The other one's more positive.
Acceptance?
Sorry?
Something around acceptance, like within a community or something?
Pride, maybe?
Like pride-related things are kind of okay, but the other one is kind of awe, like, oh, wow, that's amazing, right? If you think about it, you think back to any piece of content you shared, and like some of the most memorable are like, wow, I can't believe that happened. That's so amazing, right? Like, oh, a moon landing is an extreme example. A more personal one might be like, oh, my friend just like ran a marathon. That's incredible. Good on them. But the more awe-inspiring, the better. However, anger wins out. Anger is often more powerful, and it's much easier to exploit. It's much, much easier to make someone angry than it is to make them awestruck. And so purely in terms of any kind of repeating system that goes through multiple iterations of even a small bias, that bias gets massively, massively amplified. I'll give you a very simple example. So in tech, among other industries, there is a significant difference between the level of seniority of people that correlates quite strongly with if they're male. And the reason for this is that even the tiniest little bias, it's basically compound interest, right? If you want to get promoted from level 4 to level 5, and you have like even a 1% chance of that being more likely because you're male, unfortunately, that compounds at level 6 and 7 and 8 and 9 and 10, right? And so the same thing happens where if I get a piece of information that's been shared via 5 of you, if each of you was at least moderately more biased to share something anger-inducing, then the feed I'm going to get is going to be more full of anger. Now, the good news is, our feeds aren't constantly full of anger because Facebook's trying to do something about it. But that's just one of the most obvious biases. There are plenty of others at play as well, let alone just the basic kind of habit formation of it.
It reminds me of evolution. It helps me to think about it in terms of evolution, that the strongest traits survive, and that's true of messages that happen on a platform like Twitter, especially where it's public. That Darwinian theory kind of wins out for the messages that don't pick on those biases.
Yeah.
So
absolutely.
The headquarters for tech platforms that we use the most for our information and communication are all based in the US, which you've spent some time working there, and you might have a good perspective on the differences. What are the implications of using US-based technology from here in Australia, considering that there's more pressure and discussion around legislative oversight, especially around sharing news recently with the ACCC situation?
Yeah, it's interesting. So to start with, there are some of the things that are, to me obvious because I've been thinking about it for a while, but until you experience it, it's not so obvious. Just basically the people that build the technology, as much as we try to build for everyone, it's difficult to put ourselves in everybody's shoes. You just can't. It's really difficult to build an app for a blind person if you've never met one, let alone if you've never closed your eyes. And that might sound like I'm stretching the metaphor, but start turning that into other things like basic diversity. The fact that so many men in tech are involved in the production of products means that little things like, I saw a great article recently on Strava has this feature that if you're running around and someone else using Strava runs past you, you can see their name and you can see their running route and you can see a picture of them, which means you can infer where they live. Now, for any of you who are not immediately freaking out that that is a terrible feature, you should be, because it makes it incredibly easy to harass people, particularly women. And that feature was designed by a team who, if they had a bunch of women on the team, I would be surprised if they were listened to when that feature was launched. And so the same thing applies here. We have Americans designing our technology. I love Americans. I'm American. I was born there. I'm Australian too. But one of the things I've definitely noticed is that in America, there's a much stronger culture of, just do it and clean up the mess afterwards. Let's just innovate. Innovation above all else. And that's one of the reasons why America is so dominant. But at the same time, it's, as you say, it's kind of Darwinian theory. It's survival of the fittest. And in this case, the fittest doesn't mean the best for society. It means most willing to take large numbers of risks as quickly as possible, which is what the venture capital industry does. So that has big ramifications, but it's not to say that we're powerless.
That's a bit of a scary thought, because it seems like government always moves a little bit slower than business anyway. And if Australia as a culture is less likely to take risks, then it could mean that we're behind the 8 ball even further. I did hear about a study where that showed that Australians are more likely to change their opinion about a politician if they if they're encouraged to think that politician has been telling mistruths or misinformation. Much more likely to change their opinion about the politician than an American would be. So I don't know why that might be the case, but I think we have some amount of luck that we hopefully we have a bit more natural resilience in that space. When we were speaking earlier, you mentioned around that if we make some legislative changes here, then because those tech platforms are playing in our country, and I'm not sure exactly what our market share of their total revenue would be, but they will have to respond to that. So do you want to talk about that a bit more?
Yeah, sure. So there's a really good blogger, I suppose, Ben Thompson. He does Stratechery, And he's done an article that I think is really, really good about this, which I'd be happy to send around. So by the way, he's not in Australia at all, and yet he focused on Australia's news media bargaining code, breaking down the code and Australia's fake news. And essentially, he made a really interesting argument that I like as kind of showing why this matters. Before I get into that, first, has anyone here not heard of GDPR? No? Okay, great. That's good. Okay, so Sam, basically General Data Protection Regulation. It's regulation in Europe to protect European citizens' data globally. And what's interesting is Europe is a big enough market that, of course, you would think, oh, well, they have to comply and everything. And yes, they do. And I've worked on, and I'm actually literally currently working on GDPR controls for Atlassian and Google. And it essentially means you have to do certain things like allow people to opt out of personalized tracking to use your service. And it actually makes it unacceptable to say, oh, well, if you want to opt out, you just can't use it. Which is interesting. It's a different philosophy to the States. And now the ACCC here is trying to enforce a bargaining code between large tech platforms, specifically Google, and Australian news media. This in itself is not intrinsically good or bad. The nature of what they've proposed, I have some strong concerns about. But there's something interesting to it, which is currently a negative thing, but could be turned into a positive thing. They have actually put into this code that news platforms need to have agency over where their content is shared. Now, this, again, kind of sounds mild, but what it means is that if one of us wants to share an article from The Australian to the rest of us, that The Australian can go and see that we've done that, and potentially, if one of us comments on that article saying something defamatory about a politician on Facebook, right? The fact that we've still commented on an Australian article from The Australian, they can then say, oh, that's not okay. We're going to delete your comment, or we're going to take down your share of that article. Now, if this isn't scaring you yet, the reach for this is global. It essentially means that as long as these companies exist at all in Australia, they have to change their entire global mechanisms and operations to support this. It means that if two people that none of us have ever heard of in a country that none of us can name share this article from The Australian from one to the other, Rupert Murdoch still has agency over what they've done and can still take action. Now that's scary as it is, but the silver lining is that it's a good example of how Australian regulation can actually affect and influence these players globally. And I think that that's a good thing. And that's where Facebook may seem disingenuous for saying like, oh, yes, we want more regulation, please regulate us. But they're not wrong. They're trying to speed up that government is slow, and they're doing what they can in the meantime. And they shouldn't be the ones who make some of these big decisions, and they know it.
And Google and Facebook have at least put on the face that they are willing to, or they're threatening to pull out of operations in Australia altogether, which I'm not sure if anyone can believe that they would want to do that. But it's raised some interesting conversations. There was an article recently that's saying that if that happens, would the ABC be able to step in and provide an alternative social network for us all to use in Australia that would be sort of, could be open source, it could be to our best interests. It's hard to fathom that reality, but it's certainly, it's going to be interesting times ahead with that ACCC talks, and also the Twitter, Facebook, and Google are all being, they all have to testify in a couple of weeks' time at a Senate hearing to revise Section 230 of the Communications Act, I believe, some act similar to that, which is United States based, but it's to do with those platforms' responsibilities for what gets published or what gets posted on there, and whether the extent of curatorship and the responsibilities that come along with it. So there'll be definitely a lot that's going to be happening in that space. We should probably turn towards some solutions as well. If we know about these techniques that platforms use, and you're aware of the one-sided point of view that you see, is that enough to protect us from being harmed or from the ill effects?
It's like the way that the Center for Humane Tech breaks it down. There are actions that we can take as users, as people. There are actions that technologists can take, so we as technologists, especially if we work in these platforms, and there are actions the government can take. I think we can certainly help ourselves. You know, I have very few notifications on my phone. I recommend the same to all of you. I make it go grayscale at a certain time of night. Or there are things like that that you can do to protect yourself. But in the end, you know, self-serving protectionism is not going to help the society. And that's one of the things that I saw in America, is that everything is very individualistic, to the point of that I don't really think it's sustainable in some ways. So yes, there are absolutely things that we can do. You know, the interesting point is, though, the boundary between as individuals trying to deal with these systems versus as technologists trying to build around them or within them. I think the ABC social network example is fascinating because, you know, you could think about like, well, if that were to happen, you know, if they were to, you know, deign to reach out to any of us and say, hey, we're doing this thing, can you give us some advice? There are so many things we could do. You know, there are some of the best practices we could take that the large platforms have adopted. Things like Twitter's somewhat recent, you can't share certain things unless you have actually literally clicked to open them. So if you see a tweet about a news article, you literally can't share that article until you've at least clicked through. Which reduces shares and, you know, increases, you know, reducing shares is like a scary thing for a company like Twitter. But it turns out that it seems to have the kind of asymmetric effect they're looking for, that it disproportionately reduces what they think of as the wrong shares. And look, there's a whole who watches the Watchmen question there, but I do believe that we generally have common ideas of what is good. We just have diverging ideas of how to execute on it, especially as things get more polarized. We could talk about something more specific though.
Well, I was at risk of asking a more general question. So are there a lot of, so I think these platforms can be demonized a little bit for not doing anything, but the truth is there has been some positive shifts, such as what you mentioned there. YouTube's also introduced an option to say how long you want to watch for and give you a warning when you have exceeded that. I don't know, has anyone ever used or hit that? I didn't know about that until I read about it in an article. Yep, someone's used it there.
That's great.
And so, yeah, there is movement from the platforms in response to this, but it's too often seems to be a bit of an opt-in, or only if it doesn't impact the bottom line too much. So, well, I mean, what are the solutions here? If we've got, if we had an Australian only ABC run social media network, we could rebuild it from the ground up. But what do you think the solutions might be for the existing platforms if we do continue to get to use them?
Yeah, I think there are some things that can be continued to be built upon. For example, increasing the friction to share things, especially certain kinds of things. We also want to be careful not to stray too far into assigning the platforms to try and solve the problem that actually comes from the content. Platforms are amplifiers, you know, and that means that the sort of content that news publications or disinformation campaigns produce can be more easily brought out into the world, and they have much broader reach. So that is dangerous, and that's what platforms should be working on, is the reach. But it's also important to recognize that, you know, I read a really interesting example that caught me completely by surprise. In the 2016 US election, the New York Times published 10 articles about the two candidates, Trump and Clinton's policies, out of something like 160 total articles about the election, just 10. And you know what else they published 10 articles about? Was the Clinton email scandal. I'm putting in air quotes because nothing actually ever came of it. They literally gave the same amount of coverage to that as they did actual policy differences. So there's definitely something going on in terms of content that people consume. And I've just read a really interesting abstract from a study that essentially looked into disinformation campaigns and conspiracy theories, finding that yes, social media platforms absolutely play a supporting role, but it's only a secondary and supporting role in spreading them. These are actually very concerted campaigns that come from the American political media ecosystem. And social media is part of it, but it really is mass media and elite driven. So what could we do though? You know, if we have something like this Australian network, we can do things like limit sharing. We can do things like use existing fact-checking sources, tie into the best practices. The existing platforms have been cross-collaborating a lot more to try and clearly identify when, oh, someone's posted a new beheading video. Well, here's the hash of that video. Please run all your video uploads through this checker first, right? They're doing more and more of that collaboration. I think one thing that's I'm expecting to see over the next, I don't know, year or so is a shift from all content as soon as someone posts it is visible to, you know what, maybe we can slow things down based on a sliding scale of how risky it is that it might actually be harmful content. And if we think it's likely to be harmful, but we're not totally sure, we just kind of give it a few hours before it appears in everyone else's feeds. And during that time, we kind of prioritize it in the moderator queue. Those are the sorts of tools and techniques that can try and balance scale and accuracy that I'm sure, honestly, they probably already try some of this stuff and we don't even know about it.
Mm. We've got a few minutes left for questions. If there are any, pop them in the chat. And while you're doing that, yeah, one thing that occurred to me, there's a statistic that's quoted in the Social Dilemma documentary that by adding a single word that adds outrage to a tweet, it increases the likelihood that that will be retweeted by 17%. And thinking about the compounding nature that Joel mentioned earlier. So I wonder if that can be determined through a study, then potentially if there are any, if a tweet has something that adds that has an outrageous word in it, then maybe show it 17% less in people's feeds, and that way it balances with maybe more nuanced and balanced views, and it counters some of those biases that we might implicitly have.
Yeah, I agree. Those are very interesting directions to go. What's kind of interesting to me is there is a huge disconnect in different industries between the level of sophistication in dealing with these things. So, all of you who are technically inclined, check out perspectiveapi.com. It's an API that Google provides where you can send it a string, a sentence, a block of text, and it will return you back a float, a number from 0 to 1, essentially, which is like a percentage rating of how toxic what you've just written is. And so if I write something like, that's a terrible idea, it'll probably get like a 0.7, I'm going to guess. And if I say something like, I agree to disagree, that might be like a 0.2, maybe a 0.1, right? And then if I say like, oh, break a leg on Sunday, it'll be fine because it's quite smart actually. And if I say I'm going to break your legs on Sunday, again, it's a high number. And it actually can give you more nuance as well. It can detect, flirtation, harassment, attack on the author, like literally ad hominem. This thing is pretty interesting. And there are some industries that have like never heard of such a thing, and they're still thinking like, oh, well, if someone writes the word angry, then like I'll censor their tweet, This is way more sophisticated, and platforms, like all the moderation tools used by the big tech platforms, do this kind of thing already. So I think it's an interesting question of how much more can they do, and I think it comes down to some of what you've alluded to around taking action that they're willing to take to impact the bottom line, which is sensible. Facebook, Google, many actually post-election ad bans. They're all designed to basically reduce the chance of Trump calling it a fraudulent election as soon as he knows that he's lost, right? And he's setting that up already. But they're at least trying to limit the damage. And that's going to cost them. It's not going to cost them much, like a few tens of millions of dollars. So it's an easy decision. But what if it costs them more than that? What if they could do more than just ban the ads? What if they can monitor the content? Turns out they're doing that too. So I'm happy to see that they're taking good steps. And I think for all of us here, really the interesting thing is like some of the things they're doing can be applied to more different areas. The things we work on, or things we know other people work on, that our friends work on, just spreading more awareness here, because that's something that we can't really ever totally trust the platforms to do, nor should we, to actually spread that level of awareness, because that's a level of self-interest that is very difficult to act against when we talk about cognitive biases.
Yeah. I'm concerned about time. We got a few questions that popped through there.
Yeah,
so quickly, JJ, how can we help the Centre for Humane Technology? We'll probably plug the website here. There's a contact form to subscribe to a newsletter that doesn't super exist yet, but will hopefully. I'll pop that in the chat, or actually, James, if you could pop that in the chat to everyone, that'd be real handy. And and we've got Twitter and Facebook, so you can follow us on that and just get in contact. Yeah, we're currently sort of working on our strategy to on moving forward. So we'll be able to. Yeah, we're looking for, I guess, people with connections in government, people who are maybe in the academic space as well, who know about sort of writing white papers and publishing articles, and might have some good connections in with academics who are across these sorts of industries. Jeremy, what do you think about time for?
I think we can go until 7, and we'll have to put a hard stop at 7.
Okay, let's see if we can be concise in answering as many questions as we can. So what are our thoughts on finding the right balance between encouraging good quality content to be produced and managing power to the tech companies for its distribution and moderation?
I'll take a first crack here. I think one thing to be cautious about is, when we talk about good quality content, I imagine those of us here probably have a reasonably similar set of some sorts of liberal values, where good quality content is the kind that, alluding to another question here, is challenging anti-mask guidance, right? Good quality content is rapid and early sharing of early signals, as what happened actually in Washington State, in the States. Oh, hey, we've actually had a local hotspot here. We've done the math. It means this many people are infected. We need to lock down today, as opposed to the 2 weeks from now when the government realizes something is wrong. Those are like exceptionally high value things to do. How do we balance that? So this question is more about managing power to tech companies for distribution and moderation. Moderation is similar to the other question. I'll take that because I honestly think it's easier. I am currently working off the hypothesis that I think that the most damaging thing that we can do in our communication is basically block it off completely. In the sense of what has happened with my brother-in-law and I, for example, I literally cannot talk to him. It just hurts. It hurts so badly. And I try every now and then, and it's awful. And I don't mind that he has different opinions. I mind that those different opinions are so violent towards me, to the point that I'm like, I don't want to be physically near him. He's talked about carrying a knife out of patriotism. So that's scary. And that's not okay. That's the kind of discussion that's not productive. That's something that we should be moderating. We should be making it not okay for people to engage in hate speech, which is illegal, but also things that are essentially the same as hate speech, but they're not about your protected characteristic, right? I don't think there's ever a good reason someone should call another human being a cockroach. Just because that person was called a cockroach for being of a certain ethnicity, which does make it hate speech, why should someone just be that awful to another person? I'm not really sure.
And I'll flow into the next question because I think it's related. How do we allow debate while moderating content?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the freedom of speech versus freedom of reach that you talked a little bit about, Joël, is really important so that the content that we see is representative of the viewpoints. So if there's 100 replies to a Twitter post, and 2 of them are extremist, like basically nutcase responses, probably don't show me, and I can only see 5 before I click view more. Maybe don't show me those 2, just because it's going to make me engage more. And I don't think that I think that Twitter is probably taking good steps to counter this sort of phenomenon, but it's an example of a decision that can be made to get me sort of riled up and start to lose my prefrontal cortex engagement and get a little bit more animalistic in the way I'm engaging with my device, versus, well, let's show a representative view of each sides of the debates. If there can be some analysis, sentiment analysis done of those 100 tweets, then show me a broad show me a cross section of that as a sample. If there's, if there's, I was going to say, if any of, I realized I asked for text questions, but if people want to ask follow-up questions, then feel free to do so. But we'll have to finish up in about 5 minutes.
Yeah, maybe if you want to muster up to ask something face to face, I'll just answer Jeremy's question from my perspective. I think it'll be a bit of a mix. I think that basically the concerns are warranted. Some of them are just mistargeted. Like I think a lot of the blame is actually should be placed at the existing media power structures that have existed forever. There's an incredible saying, which we've all heard in some fashion, which is, along the lines of, a lie can run around the world 7 times before the truth gets its boots on, that kind of thing. I actually looked that one up because I was really curious. Do you know how old it is? It's 300 years old. The original was falsehood flies and the truth comes limping after it. So this is not a new problem. It's just massively amplified beyond what it's ever been before. And so I do think it's a big problem and it's worth addressing, but at the same time, it's important. Panic serves an important function in our society.
There's something that I want to mention. We spoke to a group. They're called Thinker, or I think it's Thinkers without an E, THINKRS. They're starting a. Do you want to? Oh yeah, please chime in, James.
Yeah. So essentially, there's Melissa. I think there's 2 other co-founders. The entire purpose behind it is to have a browser extension which contextualizes the news sources that you're consuming. So for example, it based on, crowd data, as well as people who have been like looking over the articles and like that sort of thing, as well as taking into account like, the political end of the spectrum of the people who are consuming this content and saying like how it's leaning. It'll give you information about like, okay, the person who's published this is kind of more leaning towards the left or more leaning towards the right. These are the kinds of biases that they have. There's some, machine learning backing it, and a lot of academics have been helping build out the model. Melissa is actually going to be one of our speakers at Spark Festival tomorrow, which is at 12 p.m. Yeah. That's from 12 until 12:50. I'll share a link in the chat as well. Anyway, sorry for jumping in.
No, great. Yeah, I think that's a good example of how we can give people a bit of context to what they're looking at, which helps just understand the landscape. Back when we knew we were reading a right-wing or a left-wing newspaper, because we kind of just knew what the basis of the editorial content was. We've lost that, and this sort of a plugin, these sorts of solutions can help to add that back in. Yeah, so that's yeah. James will be interviewing a few people tomorrow at Spark Festival at midday, as he said. So one of them is Nirial, who is the author of Hooked that Joël mentioned, and Melissa, who's a human rights lawyer working with Thinkers. And we also have Seth Gentle, who is an ex-Google developer and really across this stuff as well. Joel's also got something to plug. You have a talk that's coming out for Atlassian developers or something like that?
Oh, yeah, no, we so as a product manager, they put me in front of people, right? Can you tell? So yeah, I actually earlier today recorded my section of it. So yeah, like I said, if you're interested in cloud development and getting some free press for your app, or if you want to just make money, relatively easily, honestly, I would do this if I wasn't working at Atlassian, because I can't now. You can build apps on top of Atlassian products. I am working on a new development platform that makes it super easy to do that, because everything is hosted by Atlassian, so you don't have to spin up your own infrastructure. It's called Forge. We have a developer day coming up on November 10th. So I just recorded my section of the keynote for that day today. And so I'm actually really de-stressing right now. This is really pleasant. So yeah, you can go check it out. I'll put the link in the chat if you're interested in registering. It's free. You can just go look at the stuff online. There's a whole bunch of great talks from people on my team too. Thanks,
awesome.
Sean.
Yeah, thanks for joining, and thanks for the chat. It was really good. Hopefully everyone got something out of it. And I'll pass back over to Jeremy now to kick into the next talk.